Welcome to Press Review with me, Iain Martin, the editor of Reaction Press Reviews, the show where we, the Reaction editors, pick our stories of the week, the things that have caught our eye from podcasts, newspapers, and all the rest from around the world. So it's global in focus. First choice, Maggie, kick us off with your very interesting take on a story that you've spotted, which reveals a lot about what I think is probably the biggest story in the world at the moment.
Yeah, it is. And we've obviously had President Macron having his hissy fit over the AUKUS deal between Britain and Australia. And there was a lot of talk that actually the French knew that that submarine contract was going to go. And then the story I have spotted, thanks to somebody tweeting it, who I can't remember, but a defense specialist. And the story is dated January the 19th this year. It's by somebody called Thomas Newdick of The Drive, which is an online American defense specialist magazine. And he says, this is January, remember, so 8 months before this contract unrolled, that the Australian Financial Review had reported in depth that the Australian government was in talks with the naval group because they were deeply unhappy with the way the contract was going. And it was a very well-sourced story, talks about the fact that apparently 60% of the work for the submarines was meant to have been given out to all local suppliers in Australia. The naval group apparently weren't doing this. There was even talk in this story that the Australian Defence Minister was having talks with Saab about an alternative because they were so unhappy. And there were other issues, but the intellectual knowledge was being kept in France and not transferred to Australia. So the idea that the French can say that they were surprised by this. They may have been surprised by the announcement of AUKUS, but they can't have really, from what one is seeing, be surprised that the deal, was going to be changed.
Yeah,
or whatever. No.
It is an illuminating report because in the days after the announcement, there was a lot of speculation about how on earth could French intelligence have missed this, and you're absolutely right, Maggie. They may have missed the surprise announcement from Biden, Boris, and from the Australian Premier, but the signs were there, and actually written down and reported that the arrangement with the French was was in serious doubt miles out. It's such an interesting story, this, which spans the globe, and it's good to see. It's a kind of story where we have to tap into sources from from Australia, from the US, and tap into what the French press are doing as well. Closer to home, one of my picks though is a piece by Jeremy Cliffe in the New Statesman. I know we keep mentioning the New Statesman probably too much on this show, but we'll avoid the New Statesman next week. But it's by Jeremy Cliffe, I think he's their international affairs editor or assistant editor, and of course ex-economist, on the profound implications of the deal. And it's his latest piece of the New Statesman. Essentially says, well, you have to see this in terms of nuclear proliferation in the Pacific. I don't necessarily agree with him, but he's right about the increased risk that in the Indo-Pacific there's going to be more of a focus on nuclear-powered submarines, nuclear weapons as well, and that this is creates the potential not only for a Cold War but for a hot war. Tim, what have you made of the story this week? And I described it earlier as the biggest story in the world at the moment. I know there's lots of other interesting stuff happening, but it does portend a big geopolitical shift, doesn't it?
It's been interesting. I listened to American podcasts, probably too many American podcasts, and actually they have been very focused on this issue. They've, it's normally the American podcasts I listen to, political podcasts, are very domestic orientated. It's rare that they're really shifted onto something like this. The overwhelming consensus is that France has behaved badly, but the relationship with France needs to be repaired. And interestingly, and I don't think this is just because it's something that I listen out for, I think it's genuine. It's been interesting to hear commentators from across the American spectrum note that perhaps because Britain is out of the European Union, Britain has more flexibility to do arrangements like this, and they see it in some way as Britain coming of Brexit age, if you like. And so it's been interesting for the Biden administration, which of course is quite sceptical about Brexit, to have really given Britain this this opportunity that it hasn't been willing to give to France. Now, perhaps that's just motivated by the commercial demands of the submarine contract, but the results are in, and Biden has done a deal with Britain outside of the European Union, not France inside the European Union, and that hasn't failed to hit the notice of American foreign policymakers.
And it was funny this week, wasn't it, the way in which one particular comment from Boris Johnson, donnez-moi une break, or whatever it was, speaking in franglais, telling the French to get a grip when he was in when he was in the US this week, drove and you see this on social media time and time again, and in some of the reporting across parts of the British press who still haven't sort of figured out Boris Johnson, drives them completely mad. Whereas it's clearly a deliberate strategy. He's slightly trolling President Macron, but also saying something, as he did at the UN with his Kermit remark, which is designed to grab attention. And his critics still can't see that this is a very clever technique. So Twitter went into meltdown this week over various Johnson comments, but still his supporters really like it. Tim, I'm going to ask you for your next choice. We move on to another podcast, I think, and this time different part of North America.
Well, you say that everyone is talking about the submarine deal. Of course, everyone is not talking about the other big event in the world, which is the Canadian election results. I remember, I think 10 or so years ago, Iain, trying to get, I think we were at a Tory conference, and I was trying to get you interested in Stephen Harper. I think you were there with Fraser Nelson, and I couldn't get you excited about what I thought was incredibly important going on in Ottawa. Well, I think I've given up largely trying to get people interested in Canadian elections. But even the Canadians this time aren't that interested in their election. This was an election that wasn't necessary. Justin Trudeau called because he thought he would win a majority. In a lackluster campaign, he failed to win a majority. He actually got elected re-elected as Canadian Prime Minister with just 32% of the vote. It's the lowest that a Prime Minister has ever got in Canadian history. It's because they have a first past the post system with candidates split right across the political spectrum. But it just sort of underlines for me how hard it is for a Conservative to get elected in Canada. The Canadian Conservatives got about 1.5 percentage points more than Trudeau, but their vote is sort of, is all accumulated in sort of the west of Canada and in rural Canada, and whereas the Liberal Party's vote, Trudeau's party's vote, is well sort of well spread throughout the urban areas, and the Tory candidate for Prime Minister, Erin O'Toole, he moved to the centre. He embraced lots of sort of mainstream Canadian opinions, which, as you know, Canada's a very liberal country. That seemed to increase his support in key battlegrounds on Ontario, but he's now got this populist party that scored just over 5%, now nipping at the Conservative heels. So it's for those who are interested in politics, it's a fascinating story of an election that was fought. But I think probably you can make a case that being Conservative leader in Canada is about the hardest job for any Conservative in the world. And Erin O'Toole, unfortunately, cheered on, I think, by most of the Conservative world, fell short on this occasion.
And what's for people who want to tune into the podcast to hear more, what was the podcast that you wanted to highlight, Tim? So
it's called CPAC Politics Today, and it is a daily podcast. It's what happens is you get the anchor interviews a Canadian journalist, And so those of us who are interested in Canadian politics, we can get a 15-minute fix each day. And this one was interviewing John Iveson, who is a columnist for the National Post magazine, really good commentator. But they'll interview a sort of conservative-minded commentator one day, a liberal-minded commentator the next day. And it really is, I find, it's the best way of keeping up with Canadian politics. Should that be your delight?
Yeah, John Iveson, an old colleague and friend of mine from Scotland, and we worked together on Scotland on Sunday, and then he moved across to Canada, and as you say, has become one of the leading.
Probably the premier one, I think.
Yeah, why am I saying one of the leading? The leading.
Just in case he's watching.
But he's a fantastic writer and talker about politics, and just has a really nice, sort of finely honed blend of just enough cynicism or skepticism, and also enthusiasm for the political beat. And I actually would say that you're right, Tim. I do find you were right more than 10 years ago. Canada is interesting for the reason that you mentioned it. If Conservatives can't take power there, having shifted to the centre and done everything which they were supposed to do, and it still leaves Trudeau in power, that's just something revealing about the state of mainstream conservatism. You were going to say, Tim?
Yeah, so just one footnote, which is a little bit of interest, I think, is that where the Canadian Conservatives did make gains was in Atlantic Canada, in working class areas, and they specifically tailored some of their policies for sort of working class Canadians. And so it's yet another Anglosphere country now. We know about Britain and the Red Wall. We know about Australia, the Queensland-Sydney trade-off. We know about America, where Trump did well in Pennsylvania and Michigan, etc. Now we have Canada as well. This isn't just a Brexit effect. This is a global effect where upscale, university-educated voters are moving to the left, and downscale voters who are struggling with some of the economic challenges of our time are moving right. And I think Canada's election is confirmation of that, if we needed it.
Yeah, and I mean, it may be, of course, that politics post financial crisis is moving, has moved to the left. That's one of the big shifts, and that actually Conservative Party in Britain has spotted that, or instinctively gone where the votes are, which might explain why you have a sort of high tax, high tax big state model under Boris Johnson. But on that note, related, Maggie, your next choice is from CapX, which is a website I'm very, very fond of, having been involved in the establishment of it back in 2014. And your pick is on a survey about capitalism.
Yeah, the article is by Rebecca Wray, and the headline is "Young People Aren't Left-Wing, They Just Don't Understand Capitalism." And she's based it on a recent survey carried out by the Institute of Economic Affairs that found a quarter of people under 22 mistook the definition of socialism and capitalism. And she, it's a really good piece, because what she's saying is that most people are intuitively capitalist, but that the Conservatives are not really very good at explaining it, and that rather than sort of putting so much concentration on levelling up and so forth, what the government should be doing is actually just saying we want to make everybody wealthier, higher productivity, higher wages, and so forth. Now, I think there's a little wrinkle in this argument, which is that all capitalism is not naked. Corporate capitalism is not good, and where Conservatives allow themselves to be criticised is that they're not critical enough when capitalism goes bad. So when you have big oligopolies, monopolies, whether it's in housing, we talked about it before. But the main point was, and it was a good one, is that young people are not intuitively to the left, despite what George Bernard Shaw said. And most people today want to be their own entrepreneur and set up their own businesses, which you can't get much more sort of naked business-minded than that. So it's a good provocative piece.
But there is a problem, isn't there, in that capitalists, and there is a debate among people who believe in markets whether that's the right word to use, whether it's an unattractive word or whether it's an insult. I mean, I've tended to take the view post-financial crisis that opponents of markets are going to use that term anyway, so might as well, if not embrace it, might as well use it. And the difficulty, I think, is that capitalists have not really been able to, and it is a good piece, but I think it maybe doesn't quite address the nub of the problem, which is that capitalists can't quite, or pro-market folk can't quite decide which position to adopt. Is it that what happened in the financial crisis was, was the cause of, was triggered by big government interfering in the housing market in the US and excessively large banks? So does capitalism need reform, or is capitalism fantastic in its current format and just needs defending? And certainly the thing that always worried me was the misunderstanding around the sort of profit motive, and that large numbers of people don't quite understand what, and all the polling bears this out, what profit is for, and that profit then is recycled into the economy. It's what fuels people's pensions and pension funds, and it's somehow the profit motive being seen as a bad thing. But we're now more than 10 years, a dozen years since the financial crisis, even more now actually, and still capitalists are discussing this. I mean, Tim, you and I have talked about this for years. How do you make the case?
I think it's difficult, and one of my big conclusions from this is that even at the height of Mrs. Thatcher's popularity, most of the things that she was doing, such as privatization of some of the utilities, lowering marginal tax rates on higher earners, were very unpopular. I think what we have to realize with capitalism is that I think the fruits of free market economics are very popular, but actually the policies that are put in place to deliver those fruits aren't. And so I'm fundamentally a conservative rather than a capitalist. And I think as part of a wider conservative program, where that conservative program includes tough approaches to crime and law and order, patriotism, etc., you can sell the policy means to capitalism and hope that the fruits are produced sooner rather than later. Yes, of course, the work of organizations like the IEA is incredibly important in creating at least an intellectual climate friendly for capitalism, but converting the public to something which is so counterintuitive that effectively, as Adam Smith set out all those years ago, that the rewarding self-interest benefits everyone. It's so much harder for people to grasp onto the moral acceptability of that than communism, which, despite the fact it keeps failing, people intuitively warm to. And so I think we just have to embed capitalism in a wider program and hope that the politics catches up with the fruits of the growth that capitalist economies produce. But I think we have to be more alert as friends of free market systems to the need to be free and competitive. There's far too much concentration of power in far too many markets at the moment. That, at least in that sense, is where Elizabeth Warren is right. So there is work to do by capitalists in remembering what our fundamentals are.
And they should be brave and stand up and admit that it's flawed. Like America in the 1920s, Roosevelt, they accepted that these great big monopolies were destroying business and so forth. And they reformed them. And I think we need a similar impetus. And I agree with you, Elizabeth Warren has been spot on this.
I'm going to disagree. Well, Elizabeth Warren, maybe some of the things she said about tech are, in theory, attractive, but I think I would count her as an enemy of free markets.
Usually that's true, yeah. But just in this one area, I think she's right.
It's just on monopolies that we were talking about.
Yeah, it's things like CapX and the IEA, and of course we write about this on Reaction, are making the case for a free market or for a markets-driven approach. But I suppose the positive thing, though, Maggie, as you mentioned it earlier, is that there is enthusiasm for entrepreneurialism. But I think in a way it's not surprising that people are somewhat confused about all of this, because it's difficult to work out what this government, in speaking of Britain now, where it actually stands on all of this. And it's very difficult for business or for entrepreneurs or investors to get a clear line of sight. The government is very erratic, isn't it? It's very interventionist, quite populist in its instincts, driven by headlines and crises. I mean, we haven't mentioned yet the energy, the energy stuff, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that next week with some more story picks. But it's difficult as a pro-market person to actually say with any conviction that this government in Britain is pro-market itself.
No, it's very tricky. And actually on the energy market, you could argue that one of the reasons we've got the problem with the price cap is that they didn't allow these young new suppliers in the market, didn't hedge forward. They didn't actually use the financial markets. It's sort of quite ironic. They allowed competition, but the energy suppliers themselves didn't use the mechanism by which they could buy forward and price their products. That's been part of the problem.
Yeah. I think shall we move on to the next story then, which my pick is, I'm going to pick a story from the Daily Mail, though all papers covered it in different ways, including the Times, and the Guardian went big on it as well. But the story originally comes from Vice, the how would you describe it? The left-wing online outlet, or increasingly left-wing online outlet, who broke a story about Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister in the British government. And the Mail story, furious row over leaked WhatsApp messages from Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch saying she doesn't care about colonialism in Africa because it was only old elites who lost out. What I thought was fascinating about the story is, it was leaked from a very modern story. It was Kemi Badenoch talking in a WhatsApp group to fellow Conservatives about this subject, then leaked, presumably by I think it's made clear in the story who it's leaked by someone who would regard themselves as a Conservative, but then to Vice, and the way in which this blew up, and the way in which Badenoch was then attacked, I found really quite concerning in terms of free speech. She was talking privately, but she was also expressing quite a complex, sophisticated set of ideas about these subjects, but has found herself attacked in very crude terms, apologies demanded, and it says something about the kind of gotcha attitude on the left, which I think reveals that they do fear politicians like Kemi Badenoch, and as one of her friends said, it's it's because she's regarded, because she's a Conservative, she's regarded as the wrong sort of Nigerian, as one of her friends put it. Tim, what did you make of it?
I agree with absolutely everything you've just said, and I think it is absolutely striking. We are 1 week after the reshuffle. I think when we last recorded, it was still being completed. But the diversity of this Tory cabinet, at least according to the left's criteria, is extraordinary. You have two women at the top of holding offices of traditionally the three great offices of state. You have you have Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak holding two of them. You have Nadeem Zahawi and Sajid Javid holding the two positions, health and education, which are probably the frontline public service ministries. And then right down all the way across government. Kwasi Kwarteng, of course, has been across the news all this week as the business secretary, handling perhaps the thorniest challenge for the government at the moment. Nadine Dorries at Culture, one of the biggest briefs in government, in so many ways. I think it just completely discombobulates the left. This is supposed to be what they delivered. They are the people who are focused on, bringing women and ethnic minorities into government, and yet the Conservatives have succeeded beyond their own abilities, and I think they hate it really. And they strike out at someone like Kemi Badenoch because they hate the success that the Tories have had in this field.
Also, Tom Holland, the historian, made the very good point in response to this story in Vice. Made the observation that, of course, the decolonization movement in places like Britain is, of course, in and of itself, it's part of a kind of white savior complex attempting to impose a very kind of British or American idea of of sorting out Africa. I thought it was so interesting. Just quote the original comments from Kemi Badenoch, and they're taken from WhatsApp chat on Conservative Friends of Nigeria group. She said, "I don't care about colonialism because I know what we were doing before colonialism got there. They came in and just made a different bunch of winners and losers. There was never any concept of rights, so people who lost out were old elites, not everyday people." Now, I mean, you can agree with that or you can disagree with it, but it is a fairly it is a fair argument, but we now seem to live in a social media climate where it's even she's committed a sin of political incorrectness by as a young young black Briton of with Nigerian heritage, saying something which doesn't fit with the consensus, and so it's almost as though she's supposed to comply rather than have her own intelligent view. Maggie, what did you make of it? Because she also said something rather rude, which we won't quote on here, about Sam Gyimah, who was a Conservative colleague, and we because this is a family show, we certainly won't quote it. But she was asked whether Sam Gyimah could be Tory leader, and I think she said no with a swear word attached.
Flip no.
Yeah, flip no. But I mean, of course, she turned out to be right in that sense, in that Sam Gyimah did then leave the Tory party over Brexit and join the Lib Dems.
But it's awful, isn't it, that anyone should think that's even a story, because if they'd asked her whether, I don't know, who Nadine Dorries was going to be leader of the party, and she said no one would sort of see anything wrong in that. But the fact that he was a fellow Nigerian, it was sort of verboten. But can I go back to, I think the most interesting and really depressing, distressing point about this story is that Kemi raised a really interesting, fascinating idea, which is that the previous elites running Nigeria was, what she was implying, tribal, authoritarian, riches. They used to kill each other. There were constant warfare. And so the fact that she couldn't even make that comment and that people wouldn't find that interesting to discuss. I mean, that's the sort of thing you have at A level, isn't it? What were the causes of, why? And we used to be able to debate these ideas. Now, everything is just shut down. The second point, and I'll be really, really brief, is... That's such
a good point, though. We've lost our curiosity. Yeah. We're too embedded in positions. Oh, yeah.
It's like the Enlightenment never happened, people used to embrace, particularly British education, is that we were able to be imaginative, creative, and probe, rather than the Napoleonic European that you learn things by rote, or the Japanese approach. People came here because they loved this openness. But the second point is when she talked about property rights. Now, one of the greatest problems of if you like, the story of Africa and development is that the tribes, the local people did not have property rights. I don't know if you come across the economist Hernando de Soto. It's his big thing, and it's one of the reasons why the Chinese have been able to go in and buy up so much land with the connivance of the local governments, because they have basically just taken this land, which has been owned by them, for hundreds and hundreds of years, but they don't have anything written down, or haven't done until recently. And so her point about property rights, again, why aren't people saying, oh, how interesting, Kemi, will you tell us more about this? Let's hear your view. It's so left field that we would like to hear it.
Instead, she's shamed for committing, actually she emerges from it very well, but she's, in Vice's terms, she's shamed. It's a gotcha moment, and she's committed, the original sin of having intellectual curiosity and expressing an interesting opinion. Just onto our final choice, which is Tim from you. It's a Times podcast, which I think is with Matt Chorley.
I am Mr. Podcast, really, aren't I? I will come up with some articles at some point. Yeah. And we should apologise if this is our final choice. None of us has picked Keir Starmer's essay, which is...
I'm still reading it. I'm still reading it.
Well, anyway, sorry, I shouldn't ridicule him. Actually, to the Times, the reason why I picked the Times podcast is for another reason, but I did actually hear before the piece that I've selected, Matt Chorley got, one of those robot announcers that you can get to speak on the internet, words. He got one of those to do a read through of Keir Starmer's essay. It was very unflattering, but it was incredibly funny. So actually, if you do go to what I'm about to recommend, which is Matt Chorley talking to veteran BBC documentary maker Michael Cockerell, the Times Red Box podcast, you can actually hear the robot thing before the Cockerell interviews. But Cockerell has a book out, and he's interviewed all 12 prime ministers during his distinguished BBC career of the television age. And it sounds an amazing book, but this little podcast is just a lovely, quite moving history of his little soundbite insights into each of those prime ministers. And you get things like him meeting Macmillan, and Macmillan giving a talk, I think it was at the Oxford Union, where he remembered that he was the only person from his class of 20 to survive the First World War, and the profound impact that had on him as a politician. You had the first politicians of the television age, because you didn't have video recorders, they often weren't at home when their images were broadcast, absolutely mesmerized by looking at themselves on the television, because they'd never seen themselves and how they came across. And he said that impact on them was very powerful. Harold Wilson, who apparently before he became the avuncular prime minister that he was, didn't know how to tell jokes, but he studied JFK videos so that he could learn humor. His pipe was an affectation. He actually smoked Havana cigars in private. And then finally, before I give away the whole of the podcast, was Margaret Thatcher, of course. She would always have a good story. And she used to, when Michael Cockerell used to arrive for an interview, she used to go up close to him and say, "Oh, Michael, your tie is marvellous." And it was very close, sorry for my Margaret Thatcher impersonation, but incredibly flirtatious, which of course is what she did use Maggie with the men that she engaged with. And I think she quite preferred to be surrounded by men rather than women.
Yeah,
Did Cockerell have a favourite? Sorry, Iain. Did he have a favourite? Was he asked that?
I think he was asked that. I don't think he gave it away. I think he certainly had preference for some over others. I think Ted Heath and Gordon Brown were certainly not his favourite. He asked all of the prime ministers whether they ever had any doubts as to whether they were equipped for the top, to which Ted Heath said, no. That was another bad Ted Heath impersonation. And I think David Cameron said he had absolutely no doubts. Boris Johnson was sort of more actually engaging with that. So it's a lovely, I think it's a podcast that goes about 40 minutes, about 20-25 minutes is the Michael Cockerell section. I could have listened to it for an awful lot longer, and I do hope the BBC are going to make a documentary about the book in a way, or an extended interview with him, because Cockerell did spend time with our prime ministers in a way very few other people didn't. It's a treasure trove of anecdote and information.
It's a really good choice, Tim. I love running into Michael Cockerell in and around Westminster. Obviously, it hasn't really been possible in the last couple of years with the pandemic. But I've had so many conversations with him down the years, just whether the quality of his insights. And you asked a question like who are his favourites, Maggie. In that sense, he's not coming from anywhere ideological. He just has a great gift for getting them to reveal themselves psychologically, or to highlight elements of their personality which reveal bigger truths about what they're like as people. And he has a sense of the ridiculous and the absurd. And he's one of the great chroniclers of the post-war age. Makes fantastic documentaries. And I think on that note, we're going to wrap things up for this week on Press Review, the show from the Reaction editors, where we pick the stories which illuminate the big trends and the things that are interesting happening in the world. And we're on every single week. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction, just hit subscribe on the button below. Please like this video as well. And if you want to see more from the team, go to the Reaction website, address below, and you can get my weekly newsletter on politics for subscribers every Saturday morning, as well as all of the other brilliant stuff that the team do. But until next time, thank you very much for watching.